Thank you for watching the creation of the American government PowerPoint. Let's go ahead and get started. So at the end of the last class, I was sort of hurrying at the end and I ended kind of with this slide. So I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to start with this slide and just make sure that I explain it clearly and further than maybe what I did in class. So as the war comes to an end, we kind of take a look at how revolutionary was the Revolutionary War. And what we find out is that in some ways it is very revolutionary. It's a new way of thinking. And we talked about the spirit of 76, this collection of Enlightenment ideals, this idea that people can govern themselves, which is a very new idea, really, relatively speaking, for a country of our size. This idea that all men are created equal. That if a government is tyrannical, you throw it off and you put in a new government that does protect your rights. So you take all these ideas of Rousseau and Montesquieu and John Locke and Thomas Jefferson and Ben Franklin, and you kind of wrap them up into the idea of the spirit of 76. And that inspired a lot of people to contribute to the war effort. And then as we kind of reassess how much that was accomplished, the spirit of 76 was accomplished, we could say kind of to a certain degree, a mixed degree. You certainly have influence on other countries. So we talked about France and Haiti, for example. It led to their revolution. And then in America, you do have a certain increased amount of democracy. But I think if we kind of are critical, we could have gone further. And so let's kind of take a look at that. So what we would say is the Revolutionary War was a political revolution. We threw off the British government. No longer did we have to worry about an external force ruling over us. And so for white male property owners, yes, the Revolutionary War to a great extent was revolutionary. And then these people would, have more democracy bestowed upon them, more and more. And so, for them, yeah, it was a revolution. But if we take a look at kind of the rest of the social hierarchy, and if we include Native Americans and women and African Americans, really, for the most part, the people that were elite before the Revolutionary War remained elite. The people that were kind of in the middle stayed in the middle, and the people that were on the bottom stayed on the bottom. As for the natives, remember they're kind of in a bad spot. They didn't like the colonists because the colonists were trying to get into their land. So they sided really with the British, and then with the peace treaty of 1783, the British just really kind of, they messed the natives over. And so they gave all that land to the colonists, now the United States, and people started flooding into the Ohio River Valley and into the frontier. And so the Revolutionary War was a bad thing for the natives. Okay, in terms of slaves. Now, in the North, we're going to see that conditions are going to get somewhat better for the slaves, and that the Revolutionary War in the spirit of 76 is a slight improvement for slaves in the North. So we'll talk about that in a little bit. But as for the slaves in the South, the Southern economy is totally tied to slavery at this time and at this point, and they're not willing to give it up. So in terms of the Revolutionary War, it was not very revolutionary for the slaves. And then for women, we talked about in class this idea of Republican motherhood. And although women aren't going to gain political rights at this time, and they won't really until either individual states do this on their own, or for like voting for national elections, it's not going to happen until the 1920s. So women are still a long way off in terms of equality. And the one thing that does bring them a little bit increase in status during this time was this idea of Republican motherhood, that, hey, you are a mother, you play a role in this republic, you raise sons who are going to be virtuous, and you're going to bestow on them morality, and they are going to someday run the government, and they're going to do it in a wise way. And so you can kind of see the picture down at the bottom. Instead of having the father, everybody's kind of looking towards the mother, and she is kind of the most important figure. Okay, so let's talk about how and in what ways democracy did increase. So first of all, uh, as we get rid of Great Britain, something that's kind of groundbreaking for us is that while other European countries are kind of our contemporary countries they're still using the laws of primogeniture. That's not going to happen in this new United States. And so those second, third, and fourth sons, now they are going to be able to get land, and as they get land and own land legally, now those people are going to be able to vote, whereas maybe they didn't have legal right to land before. Now they will, so now they can vote. And I put a map down at the bottom of the screen, and I know you probably can't see it like extremely well, but if you take a look at like Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, if you look at Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia, you will see that their capitals have been moved kind of westward. Now, New York is another good example of this, where they take the capital from the mouth of the Hudson River and then take it up to Albany. And the reason they do this is to sort of assuage the frontiersmen, these people that don't have a lot of access to their state capital. It's hard for them to serve in government if they can get elected, because the roads aren't very good, and all the state capitals were on the East Coast. And so as kind of a way to give them slightly more democracy, places like Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Pennsylvania, they move their capitals at least somewhat westward, so that it's not so far for these people to come to their state capital. And so, it wasn't a huge increase of democracy, but this is a way of us kind of compromising, and the East-West tension is not going to go away, but this helps it at least a little bit and increases democracy. Okay, another thing that is at least a slight nod to more democracy is the disestablishment of official churches throughout the 13 states. And so we would kind of get this secular idea of the separation of church and state. And, it wasn't very fair. It wasn't very democratic that if you didn't belong to the Puritan church, that you still had to pay taxes to it. Same thing in the South, where the Anglican church was a lot of times the established church. Now you don't have to pay that tax. And so at least, to some degree, that's a little more democratic. Okay, and then as I alluded to before, one of the great steps that we'll see the North take is that they're on their own. They're going to start getting rid of slavery. And so, from the late 1700s to the first couple of decades, all of the states in the North are going to end up getting rid of slavery on their own. Nobody's going to make them. They're just going to do that. And that's led by states like Pennsylvania, where you have a strong influence by the Quakers, where, it's against their religious ideas. And, furthermore, the northern states, their economy and their climate just didn't support slavery like it did in the South. And so you don't have long growing seasons. You don't have cash crop farming. And so there wasn't necessarily a need to have slaves like they did in the South. And so it was much easier for the northern states to give up their slaves. Now, I do want to also point out that this is one of those things that's going to start the division between the North and the South. And so really what's going to start to happen between now and the 1860s, 75 years later, is that we're getting two countries almost. We're getting a northern country and a southern country, separated by geography, separated by political views, and separated by economic systems, really. And this is kind of the beginning of it. Okay, so now the states are going to start creating their own constitutions, and a constitution, is a written framework for government. It kind of spells out the powers of the government, what the government can and cannot do. And oftentimes, what we're going to see are these states, they're going to create Bill of Rights, but they're going to have some commonalities amongst them. And one of them is that they're written. It's a public document. Everybody can see it. They know what powers the government has. And that's important. That's going to be an important thing to Americans. We also see throughout the 13 states is that they create these state constitutions with strong legislative branches, strong branches that make the government, make the laws for the government, and at the same time, a very weak executive. In fact, some of the states don't even have a governor at all, and we want to think contextually here. They're doing this while the Revolutionary War is going on, and they're fighting this war to get rid of a tyrannical ruler, in their opinion. They don't want to replace him with a strong governor, so they almost err the other way and don't put in a strong executive or one at all. The other thing that they do is most of the states are going to have just 1 year term for congressmen, and so this keeps them very in tune with what the people want. And if they don't, then they get voted out, and they don't have a lot of security in their job. And you could view this as a good or a bad thing, but the one-term congressman made them very in tune with what their constituency wanted. And then, of course, we still have that property and tax requirement to vote. Students oftentimes ask why they had that. Well, remember that if you have services, any kind of services from the government, those are paid for by taxes. And so the idea was that if you own property, then you kind of had a stake in what was going on. You paid your taxes, and then you deserved those services. And so that's kind of why, if you had property and you had invested in land, then you kind of would invest in the country, and you would care about voting, and you would care what went on. And so that's why they had that property and tax requirement to vote. All right, so now let's talk about the creation of the national government. And the creation of the national government this time is called the Articles of Confederation. And again, much like the state governments, it's created on the fly. It's created by the Second Continental Congress during the Revolutionary War. And so, you have to understand when they develop this thing, they're going through this war, and it shapes the way that they design this government. They start putting it together in 1777, but because of the exigencies of the war, they don't end up finally approving it until 1781. Now, what they created was something called a confederacy. A confederacy is a loose association of sovereign or independent states, and it's almost like independent countries who only come together in a time of mutual need. Now, at this time, that mutual need was war and trade. They set up a very weak central government. In other words, if you kind of remember in AP World talking about, as nations become states, you have this centralization of power. You go from a feudal system where it's very decentralized to a state system where it's very centralized. Well, this is kind of the opposite again. This is where you're putting the power in the 13 state governments, and the national government really is pretty weak. And they did that on purpose. All right, features of America's first Constitution, the Articles of Confederation. Remember, we said a constitution is a written framework for a country's form of government. Much like the state governments, they are going to kind of copy this and create really a one-branch government, and that is the legislative branch. And so, their job is to make laws for the country. At this time, unlike our Congress today, it's unicameral. So unicameral means just one group, one house. And whereas today we have a bicameral legislature with two houses, the House of Representatives and the House of, and the Senate, excuse me. And but this time it's just unicameral, so there's one group, and it was made up in terms of apportionment from equal representation. And so, states may send delegates to Congress, representatives to Congress, but when it came to voting, each state only got one vote. So Virginia would get one vote, Massachusetts would get one vote, New Hampshire would get one vote, and this system really kind of favors the smaller states. And we'll see that the larger states don't necessarily like this system in the long run. They also had the authority to make foreign treaties and, for trade and protective alliances. And what we kind of need to understand is that, like today, this would be done by the executive branch for the most part. Now, the Congress would approve the treaties today, but the executive branch would do this today. But there is no executive branch. There's no judicial branch, and excuse me, and so they don't do that, and so the legislative branch does. All right. Successes of the Articles of Confederation. It's hard to find success in or successes in a constitution that only lasted about I don't know, really 10 years. I mean, if you we really didn't have it, it was only 6 years after they ratified it that they started looking to take it apart. So this wasn't a very successful government in a sense. But let us kind of look on the bright side here. And so, in terms of a confederacy, I mean, it did everything that a confederacy needed to do. It decentralized power. It gave power to the local areas, and so in that sense, that it was a success. Many people have pointed out that it was kind of like an evolution of government making, and so we went from what we thought was a tyrannical government to a weak government, and then eventually to the government that seems to have been working since we've had our current constitution for over 200 years. So this was a good in evolution, not revolution. All right, but probably the two greatest successes of the Articles of Confederation has to do with land policy, and we'll talk about land policy a little bit later and the fight over land by the 13 states. But a couple of ordinances come out of here, and so I'm going to kind of lump the land ordinances 1784 and 1785 together. And what this does is it takes the land north of the Ohio River and it divides it up into what we would call territories. And these are not colonies. It's very important to understand that even though they may resemble colonies, at least at first, they have a path to statehood, and that's important. And so what they did then is they took these territories and they divided them up into these 36 square mile townships. And those 36 section townships, 6 by 6 square miles. And then if we kind of take a look at this, I'm going to fast forward really quickly. If we kind of take a look at the picture here, you can see that these 6 by 6 sections down there in kind of the middle of the screen, they would be subdivided and subdivided until you got down to the picture where you see the A, B, C, D, and E, and they would be sold off into individual farms. But the sale of this land would be money for the national government. And then if you take a look at the section 16, where there's kind of an arrow pointing to it, the sale of that land would actually go to the local government, and they would use that to provide schools. And that's kind of one of those relocation diffusion ideas from New England, where they had placed value in public education and tax supported public education. And we won't see this very much in the South. And again, that's another division between the two, where the common person is going to be able to more readily have access to education as opposed to the South, and that's going to cause that division that we've talked about. But this is what the Land Ordinance of 1785 did. You can still see kind of residue of that policy even still today when you fly over in a plane over like the Midwest or something like that. But if we go back to this, we've got 36 sections total, 1 square mile each. And then, the money collected for the land went to pay the national debt from the Revolutionary War. Now, the other very important ordinance or law that comes out of this is the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. And this is what establishes the path for these territories to become states. And so, if you didn't do this, then it would be very much like the situation where you have the British controlling the Americans. You had taxation without representation. And so this is a way that these places could, eventually gain equal footing in America's government. And they would go from a territory to a state. All right. And so once you reached a population of 5,000 in your territory, you could elect a colonial legislature. And then once you got to 60,000, then you could write a state constitution and request admission into the union as a state. And once you did this, then you had, you'd start sending delegates to Congress, and you'd be seen as an equal. And so that was a very important, kind of feature about the Northwest Ordinance. Other important things about the Northwest Ordinance is it guaranteed a right to a trial by jury and freedom of religion. And then, probably arguably most important, is that it prohibited slavery in this Northwest Territory. Now, let me kind of fast forward. This is the territory that we're talking about, and this sets a precedent for anything north of the 31, the so-called Mason-Dixon line. And so if you take a look at the bottom of Pennsylvania, and then if you follow the Ohio River, see where it says Ohio, and anything kind of north of that, slavery had been, gotten rid of by the states themselves, or in this case, slavery could not spill into the new Northwest Territory, and it probably wouldn't have that much anyways, just because the climate and the growing season would not support it. But as future states are added, this becomes a kind of a political debate between North states and Southern states. But above that Ohio River, we're going to see that slavery will not exist. Okay. Here's what kind of the South will look like. So let me just go back to, and I want you to kind of take a look at how orderly this was done in the North compared to the meets and bounds system in the South, where they're, using like an oak tree as a point, and you take that line up to a bend of a river, and it's just kind of chaotic. And you had a lot of fighting over whose land is whose, and it just was kind of a mess compared to the North. All right. Well, we know that we don't have the Articles of Confederation anymore. And so ultimately, the weaknesses of it tear it apart, and then it puts us on the road to the Constitution that we have today. So let's take a look at those weaknesses. Okay, first of all, we talked about how every state, regardless of your population, got one vote in Congress. And, that definitely favors the small states. And if those small states kind of talk and band together, they can outvote the large states. And so let's say that Massachusetts and Rhode Island and Connecticut and states like that, they sort of band together, they could get a majority over, states like Virginia, Massachusetts, who by far had the largest population. So this was very fair to the small states, not very fair to the large states. Okay, the next weakness. It was very difficult to create a national law. And so if we take a look at today, like what is a national law today? It would be like being 21 to be able to drink or to gamble or something like that. And so that's a national law. And so if you wanted to pass a national law, you had to have roughly 2/3 of the states to do that. And, today in our government, the only time you need 2/3 is if there's like a presidential veto. You only need 51% today. So much more easy today, although even today, it's really tough to get 51%. So 2/3 is nearly impossible. And that's what they found out. Next, to create an amendment. And an amendment, if you don't know what an amendment is like a structural change to the Constitution. And so this is like, changing the fabric of the government. And to do that at this time, you needed a unanimous approval. You need all 13 states. And I mean, that is it's just impossible. It's just nearly impossible to be able to do this. And that's what they found out. Okay, another weakness, and I'm sure the states didn't view it this way, but the sovereignty rested with the states. And if you don't know what sovereignty means kind of the person or group that has the ultimate authority in a government. And at this time, under the Confederacy, the states did. And again, contextually, as they're fighting the Revolutionary War, that's kind of what they needed at the time. But they found out in the long run that if they wanted to function and work as a group, as a country, they realized that 13 states individually were not as strong as 13 states working together. And so they found out that the national government, what we're going to eventually call the federal government, just didn't have enough power to function and to carry out the jobs that it needed to do. Now, a big part of this is that there's no executive branch. And so if there's no executive branch, there's no president. They were so freaked out about having something that resembled a king that they just didn't even put it in the new government. And, the new government, the executive branch, one of the important things that it does is it enforces like tax collection. It enforces the law, but importantly, it forces tax collection. One of the ways they do this is with a group called the Internal Revenue Service. And, they have the power to make your life really miserable if you don't pay your taxes. So basically, what would happen at this time is the national government would ask you to pay taxes, but if you didn't, well, nothing would happen to you. And that's kind of like, as you guys know, a teacher asking you to do homework, but if we don't make you do it, then you're likely sometimes not to do it. And so, it's hard to run a country if you don't have tax money to pay for roads, or a navy or an army. They just didn't have the money to do it. And then, like today, there's Colorado cannot print its own money. When money is printed in Colorado at our mint, that is done by the federal government. And so there's really nothing at this time that the federal government can do to try to prevent states from printing their own money. And it caused inflation. And, it made it hard to trade between states because, they're using different forms of currency. And so it was a big mess and they had no way to stop them. And overall, just kind of a lack of central direction without leadership. Okay, now furthermore, we didn't have a judicial branch, so no Supreme Court at this time. And, that's a problem when you have issues between states. So if they fought over land, for example, if they fought over trade, you don't have an impartial jury, a group to kind of settle the dispute. And so, tensions could run high between those states before we do have a Supreme Court. Okay, furthermore, the other countries, especially the ones in Europe who we tended to deal with the most, they just thought our government was a joke. I mean, when they would send diplomats, they would make cracks like, do we send one diplomat or 13? I mean, do we even bother talking to the national government, or do we just go to the groups that have the real power, and that's the 13 states? And so we weren't seen as a very respectable world power at this time. Okay. So ending up here, further problems that arose under the Articles of Confederation. One of the biggest problems that we're going to see amongst the states are, claims of land ownership in the West, and then trade disputes between the states. So I'm going to fast forward just really quickly, and let me show you this land map. And so remember that under the Peace Treaty of 1783, the British had ceded this large tract of land, much to the dismay of the Native Americans, and gave us all this land east of the Mississippi. Well, a lot of the state governments started acquiring a lot of debt trying to fight and fend off the British during the Revolutionary War. The national government has a lot of debt fighting the Revolutionary War. And so as the war comes to an end, these states start looking, and the national government starts looking out west, and they realize that this is great land. It's great land for farming. There's lots of natural resources like trees and timber. And so, states start claiming it. And if you're a state like, I don't know, Connecticut or Massachusetts, you're kind of hemmed in by New York and places like that. And so, it makes sense that you would want to claim additional land. And then, what can you do with this land? Well, you can sell it. You can, you can lease it to business, and then they can pay you for it. And so it's a source of wealth. Like, the land really equaled wealth. And both the national government and the states realized this. The states fought between themselves, and it would just become a mess. And we realized that we needed a government to, almost like a parent, to kind of make the kids, the states, play nicely. And so we would continue to have these land disputes and then trade disputes between states where, let's say that a company from one state traded with a company in another state, and they had some sort of disagreement, who's going to settle that dispute? And largely it led to an individual state who may be biased to their own companies in their state because that helps their economy. And so that was a mess. All right, we still have east-west issues that continue, even though they moved many of the state capitals to make it at least somewhat more accessible to the Western frontiersmen. We're still going to see issues with especially farmers in the West who resent government in the East, or the aristocracy, and not that they're really aristocracy, but the rich and the powerful of the East. So that'll continue. And we'll see this with Shays' Rebellion, and we'll talk more about Shays' Rebellion in the next lecture and how it's going to lead to the dismantling of the Articles of Confederation and the rise of the new Constitution. Okay, without an executive branch, we don't have effective tax collection. Without tax collection, we cannot provide services. So we had a lack of good roads. We did not have the ability to provide a military to protect us. And so tax collection was a problem. Debt payment. We started to incur debt during the Revolutionary War to Dutch creditors, from French creditors, anybody that would loan us money. And so, what we see is that after the war, European countries they're kind of gonna stick it to us, and so France, for example, and England, they basically won't allow us to sell goods in their countries, or like France, they cut off the West Indies to us, and that really kind of hurt our economy. And they said, well, look, pay off your debts, and then we'll open it back up. But we just had no way to do that. And I think overall, we need to just understand that the states were competing against each other instead of working together. And a good example of this would be tariffs on interstate trade. And so normally we put tariffs on other countries to protect our own manufacturers, or something like that. But in this case, New York was putting tariffs on Pennsylvania, and so Pennsylvania would get mad and they would put tariffs on New York. And really, what you have a situation is, whenever you have a tariff, it works to decrease trade instead of increasing it. And so again, that would cause a problem. Okay, and we talked about that one already. All right, I believe that is it. And so we've kind of set the stage for the multitude of problems that the Articles of Confederation has. And so next time we are going to get rid of the Articles of Confederation and start looking at designing a new constitution. Thanks for